can go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. MC. I very much appreciate it. Maybe I can get Amira to join us as well. So welcome to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're coming to us from. So both to the presenters and to the participants who've joined us today for this workshop on digital trade in ASEAN, on the ground trends, perspectives and highlights. We're delighted to have really excellent panel here today with three speakers I know and am literally thrilled. They bring quite divergent, but I think coming together perspectives on each of the various issues that combine to make up digital trade and give us a perspective on digital trade in ASEAN. My name is Peter Lovelock. I'm the principal of the Fairtech Policy and Asia operations of Access Partnership, and I am doing the easy job of moderating the brainy people on the panel. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emergent and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I'd also like to thank in particular our colleagues at the Australian APEC study at RMIT, in particular Kevin Goyen, Bonnie Rivendell and Lynn Zachariah, who we could neither do this as well as we do it, nor the work that goes into where this comes from. This is one in a series of presentations to support ASEAN's work, which is sponsored by Australia on digital trade standards, and it is an ongoing relationship that has been working for several years now. A quick few housekeeping notes. The session is recorded, just to make you all aware. If you would like to make comments, and I really do encourage that, particularly because you will get a lot of interesting perspectives and opinions and factoids coming through, we encourage you to use the chat function. If you have a particularly pressing issue, please raise your hand or give a holler out to Kevin and one of us will notice and see if we can unmute you and bring you into the session. But please do use the chat function. Very quickly, let me just overview this session on digital trade. We're at something of a turning point. I've got various notes which I'll pull in and out here because I've got a wonderful team who put this stuff together for me. They've got a lot of both interesting and dry information here that's terribly important. However, digital trade is at that juncture point right now. ASEAN and the Asia-Indochina region are driving so much of our growth. At this point in time, points that many of us have made for several years now. Trade in goods has flattened and is declining. Trade in services has plateaued. Trade in digital is driving most of our international, and particularly coming from this region, the regional trade, both inter and intra-regional and global trade. It is driving the global economy, and at the same time, we have an emerging potpourri of regulatory disruptions and regulatory fragmentation. So just as we are really getting ourselves in a position to turn that engine on, we are hitting a lot of potential headwinds, some of them for the very right reasons, some of them fostered with good intent, some of them cross-cutting and creating confusion and raising compliance costs. One of the reasons we brought these three individuals together is they represent both experience and expertise in digital trade, but also quite different perspectives in their own specialities. Tui, who I will get to in a second, brings forth a lot of work that the World Economic Forum is leading overall on digital trade framing and the environment setting. Amira, again, I will introduce properly in 1 second, will help us focus on digital transactions, payments, and the broader landscape of how that feeds through and drives digital trade. And then we're lucky also to have Rajat from MasterCard, who is when I say digital identity expert, it's sort of like transactions. Everybody claims to be an identity or payments expert these days. I have two people who actually know what they're talking about, and Rajat can answer all of your questions on exactly where we are at in digital identity becoming a fundamental component of soft infrastructure and probably being one of the magic required pieces if we're going to see interoperability and digital trade regionally coalesce and come together and drive forth. Let me give you some very brief introductions. Tui Nguyen has joined the World Economic Forum as the project lead in the Asia Pacific team in 2017, where she oversees relations between the forum, governments, international and regional organisations across and in the region. She also leads ASEAN-related projects, of which this is a key one for the forum. Thuy previously practiced trade and technology law at Baker McKenzie, Vietnam, and Wong and Liu at Singapore. For those of you who've seen me do this kind of thing before, I never read these out. I never do bios. You've got this. In this case, these three are important because the experience that they bring and what they can talk about, you are going to want to go back to them. Ms. Amira Karim is the APEC Public Policy Lead in Payments and Financial Services for Amazon and has over 15 years experience in the digital policy engagement across public and private sectors. Previously, she held senior positions at Singapore's Ministry of Trade and Industry and Ministry of Foreign Affairs and has worked in the World Bank as a private sector development specialist. She brings to, therefore, the experience across all of the three constituent parts: academia, bureaucracy, NGOs, donors, and the private sector. Raja Maheshwari is Vice President for Product Management in Asia Pacific for MasterCard. Raja drives digital identity and cybersecurity business for governments in the region. He leads the development of the identity ecosystem, which helps streamlining and speeding up identification processes, reducing the cost of onboarding, managing customer risk, and preventing fraud. Again, I apologize, but it's necessary in this case. These three are actually experts in the areas that they'll be talking to. I want to do one other thing before I kick this off, and then I'll get out of the way and come back in between the presentations that the three will talk to. It's worth just framing where we're at in this region. ASEAN is a young, tech-savvy, population-driven region with a rising internet and digital penetration and participation. Some 400 million internet users, the third largest in the world, and growing at some 100 to 200,000 new participants per day. ASEAN's internet economy is expected to be worth more than $300 billion by 2025. The regional mobile penetration is the third highest in the world, as I've said, and growing rapidly. The digital payments market in ASEAN has grown exponentially and continues to do so. In 2021, it exceeded $700 billion in value. It's projected to reach some $2 trillion by 2025. And we expect we're going to smash through that very soon. Digital identities are expected to unlock economic value equivalent to at least 6% of GDP in 2030 for emerging economies and 3% of GDP in mature economies if we get it right and it becomes ubiquitous and interoperable. So the stakes are high for these three. You can blame them if we continue to get this wrong, and you should ask your questions as to why some of our regional participants and governments don't quite understand what's at stake or the importance of answering these questions. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor for 5 to 7 to 8 minutes to Thuy to kick us off with WEF's perspectives. Thuy?
Thank you, Peter. Very good day to all of you. I will share my slides, so please let me know if you can see it. Here. Can you see my slide now?
Yes, we can. You're up and clear.
Okay. Thank you for the very nice introduction, Peter. It's my pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you for having me. So since 2017, we, together with C Limited, have conducted an annual survey. And our survey gather opinion from between 40,000 to 90,000 people in the ASEAN region, and mostly from ASEAN 6 countries. And we also conducted this in close consultation with ASEAN Secretariat. I put on the slides here the insights from the ASEAN Youth / ASEAN Digital Generation Report series, because there's a history to the name, to the branding of the report. We originally named our survey the ASEAN Youth Survey, focusing on respondents aged between 16 and 35, acknowledging that as Peter mentioned earlier, that this is a predominant portion of digital consumer in ASEAN. But then COVID hits and everyone went online. So since last year, we have expanded our respondents pool to cover respondents aged above 60 as well, to make it more inclusive, right? So through this report series, we wanted to gather statistical insights on the perceptions, preferences, aspirations, and concerns of ASEAN digital consumers to inform relevant policy in the region, right? So our objective is really in overall to promote evidence-based policy in ASEAN. We were very delighted that our 2020 edition of the report was actually cited in the joint statement by the ASEAN youth ministers in 2020. So today, I wanted to emphasize three particular some observations related to digital trade in ASEAN, but more from the angle of digitalization, because as the name of our report suggests, is more on ASEAN digital generation, right? So the first observation is that even before the pandemic, ASEAN digital generations saw potential of digitalization and digital technologies in improving different aspects of their life, including their income earning power. Then we keep monitor the perceptions from ASEAN youth during the pandemic and also post-pandemic. So during the pandemic, we saw that actually COVID is among the best chief digital officer. It has accelerated digitalization in ASEAN region at an unprecedented level. Our respondents predominantly confirmed their interest to digitalize even further after the pandemic, right? So this is to infer that there's a bigger pool of digital consumers in the region, and hence a bigger digital trade market in the region. But what we want to advocate in ASEAN is not just a bigger digital trade market, but more broadly, an inclusive and sustainable digital economy for all. Hence, we also explore what were perceived as the most beneficial values brought by digitalization, the obstacles against further digitalization, as well as most needed actions that could be done to improve the current landscape. So in terms of perceived benefits, this slide summarized perfectly. For today's context, I wanted to draw your attention to the underlying item on the chart. So the benefits that I wanted to highlight are the payment efficiency, broader and more affordable access to goods and services. Exactly for these findings that I felt so connected with one of the comments that I gathered from a high-level meeting that I attended last month in Siem Reap, where a participant was saying that digitalization is a booster for trade. So I heard what you mentioned earlier, Peter, where trade in goods, trade in services was sort of in a difficult stage, but digital trade seems to be at its high. It seems to be at its highest stake, right? And moving to the next slide, in terms of obstacle, across the board, you can see that the regularly suspected barriers are related to digital infrastructure, skill gaps, and safety and security concerns. I guess these are not new, but I wanted to share with you something that I found really interesting, as you can see on the deck where I pointed the arrows to. So basically, we looked at the responses from people at different level of digitalization, right? So the green bar represents respondents who only digitalize between 0 and 25% of different aspects of their life. So they are classified as the less digitalized group. And then the blue bars represent the respondents who have digitalized most aspects of their life. 75% and above. So what we found was like for those who less digitalized, their concerns about digital skills are higher than those on safety and security, right? But for those who have been more digitalized, their concern on safety and security is higher than skills gap. So what I see from this is that getting people online is not sufficient. They need to be equipped with essential skills to really experience the benefits of their online activities, to remain online, let alone considering deeper digitalization, right? And even when they are with the right skill set, their trust on the online environment must be constantly ensured for their further digitalization, such as engaging in more vibrant digital trade activities. So that's about the barrier. So I want to move on to perspective of ASEAN people on the most needed actions for further digitalize the economy, right? And you can see on this slide, the top three most needed actions are corresponding to the barriers I just mentioned a few minutes earlier. But what I wanted to highlight is the underlying one on the chart, right? So basically, there's the call for better logistics and delivery services, and the need to promote interoperability for digital payments. These, together with the top three actions in the top of the chart, confirmed the interconnection and interdependence between the digital world and the physical world, in the sense that an inclusive and sustainable digital economy, including digital trade, is inseparable from and depends on how we improve the physical world. Could be digital infrastructure, digital skills, digital payments, and the ease for goods to move physically in the physical world, right? So as the international organization that promotes public-private cooperation, the World Economic Forum strongly believes that a whole society approach is required to tackle these issues. I also put on this slide the links to our reports in case you want more details. I hope these observations are helpful for our discussion today, and I'm around if you have further questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That was an excellent way to kick us off and frame it. I have questions.
Sure.
I'm not willing to share my data. Why not? That was on your second to last slide. That was sorry, third to last slide. One of the main blocks. Why aren't they willing to share their data?
I guess when we is this a slide about barriers? Should I share it again? Okay. Can you see it? Are you talking about this one?
Yes. So what's interesting there, because you made the point of where there's a difference between those people who are online and those people who are less online, the 70 to 100%, the 0 to 25. The standout difference is not willing to share the people who are more online are more unwilling to share their data, and that stops me from digitalization.
Yeah, so basically we provide a number of options that we thought that would be a barrier against their further adoption. So this question is posed to people who are already online, right? So we were thinking maybe data privacy could be one of the concerns. That's why we put that option in there. I think you refer to the next slide, not this one. No,
the previous one.
That one.
Yeah,
that
this one.
Yeah.
This one.
Yep, that's exactly right. And I was just trying to pass that apart. So the other one that just stands out for me because of the growth that we're seeing, I think your line, which was terrific, was COVID-19 is the Chief Business Officer for digital trade, and digitalisation is the booster shot. Did I get that right?
Yes, that's correct. Digitalization is a booster for trade.
I'm sure you're going to get quoted on that all over the place. But given where we are now and this reversion we're seeing in some of the statistics like e-commerce, was COVID-19, the fact to the extent that we can talk about it in the past tense, which is kind of questionable, is it a blip in the system? Is it something where we saw a massive set of online activity and we're now reverting to something of a more normal mean? Or are we going to see that acceleration is going to continue on? What are you seeing in the work you're doing?
Actually, that's a great question, and we are going to release the next edition of our report in November, and that's where exactly we will reveal the trend. This year's not entirely on all like digitalization in all aspects, but more on digital financial inclusion. And what we observed from last year was like the pandemic is really boosting the digitalization process in the region exceptionally. And we also asked them to see whether they continue to digitalize. And that's why we asked the question, do you want to digitalize more? What you want us to, what policy do you expect in order for you to digitalize more? And what we found was like the more digitalized people, the one with higher level of education, the businesses that have been digitalized actually wanted to digitalize more, so we see that this as a permanent trend. It doesn't just stop, after the pandemic. And actually, when we release our report in November, you'll see that the trend is very strong, particularly for financial services, payment, and saving in particular. So what we also found was like it's very important for people to really be equipped with the right skills. Otherwise, they won't be able to even experience, like the benefits, the good things out of their digitalization, right? So only when they have the right skills, they experience first-hand benefits, then they are interested to remain and even digitalize further. So I think based on the data that we gather, it's a continuous and permanent trend that ASEAN will digitalize further.
Okay. And so when the new report releases, I'm going to get to see that we are well on the path to solving digital financial inclusion and the digital divide is narrowing, yes?
Yes, I would not say digital divide is narrowing. It's a big statement, but what we found was we dive into what is the digitalization process for digital financial services, which segment of digital financial services is stronger than the other, what else need to be done to make the digitalization in financial service even stronger. And there's also a strong focus on international payment, cross-border payments, and even on financial literacy improvement, like what kind of which form of trainings, learning that the respondents prefer in the region, for example. Yeah.
Okay, thank you
just
very
a
much.
small sneak peek.
I'm sure you're going to get some other questions on this. If corporates or institutions, organisations who are listening in want to join the WEF working groups, they can reach out to you?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. Amira, did you appreciate the segue we threw in there for you about digitalisation and the fact that we're solving digital financial inclusion? We're going to see if you want to continue that theme and tell me that WEF is going to solve your problems for you.
No, I love that.
Can I pass you over to Amira Karim to take us through the world of digital transactions, please? Amira.
Sure, of course. And Peter, I think to Tui's point, digital payments has really seen an uptick since COVID. I think born out of necessity as well as experimentation. I think to Tui's point, a lot of companies that digitalized pre-COVID saw the need to adopt more tools to help them kind of go through the pandemic in a way that could maintain their businesses, right? So I guess it comes as no surprise that the pattern that we see in ASEAN over the last 3 to 4 years has really been very promising for digital payments. So we've seen that it's really surging, that, in ASEAN, we have exceeded, to your point, 2 trillion US dollars by 2020, by the end of this year, really. And I know that a lot of the statistics don't really account for digital commerce. So I think that there's a lot of incomplete data out there, and maybe our friends at MasterCard can help us solve this. But e-commerce data is a lot easier to obtain than, kind of the holistic picture of digital commerce because of the services industry. But I think it comes as no surprise that we've seen an uptick. It also probably comes as no surprise that economies like Indonesia, have emerged as the largest digital payments market in ASEAN. The volume of payments in Indonesia jumped almost 40% between 2020 and 2022. And e-commerce platforms that are native to Indonesia doubled their transactions to about 430 trillion rupiah, which is really impressive. So that's about US $30 billion. In the Philippines, it's a similar story. While there are a lot of remote locations where skills shortages is really, an issue for us all to address together, we've seen very encouraging signs that over 97%, and this is according to the Google McKinsey survey, of merchants actually accept some form of digital payments. Many of this through kind of offline QR codes that are always the entry point towards digital payments for a lot of emerging economies. And even more encouragingly, 2/3 of those merchants that were surveyed have adopted some form of collateralized, regulated digital lending facilities. Now, this is really interesting because a lot of the merchants who were surveyed mentioned that they would not have survived the pandemic without access to both payments and lending. So they see it as integral and somewhat, joined together or combined together. And I feel like this is something for us to discuss further, right? As ASEAN countries become the next mega market for digital consumer and merchant finance, there's a lot more that we can do to make that growth more inclusive. I think that's really important for us to also recognize that digital financial inclusion is really not a monolithic concept. Digital financial inclusion, has to be defined according to the country, according to the sector of the population that it's serving. So whether we're talking about merchants that are selling goods or merchants that are, or developers that are selling services online, it's really important for us to identify the specific financial inclusion needs that we need to kind of serve better. So on one hand, in a lot of remote locations, you see that access to the internet is always a precondition to being able to leverage payments or lending or any other form of digitalized finance. And of course, digital finance is not in itself, a standalone concepts. Many of them have entry points in very grassroots-based lending or payment services, whether it is mobile money or kind of community-based lending. And then in a lot of urban segments of the population, what we've also seen, interestingly enough, is that even in places like Singapore that are, kind of very, very much digitalized, there are certain segments of the population that don't have the financial literacy to really be able to fully adopt financial services that are increasingly available and targeted, to their specific needs. So, it's interesting that we see that 70% of Southeast Asia's adults remain either underbanked or unbanked. And in addition to that, a strong number of micro, small, and medium enterprises, which account for, a majority of the region's enterprises and 2/3 of its workforce, have really been locked out of mainstream finance. And this is really, something to address because it also represents a funding gap of 300 billion US dollars. Now, that's a huge untapped market for banks as well as other technology-enabled financial services. And in fact, the ADB has identified strengthening of MSMEs as the most important factor in Southeast Asia's economic recovery in the next few years. And so this is, I think, a worthwhile area for us to start thinking about as we think about ways to, collaborate between industry and government. The other kind of fascinating trend, as pertaining to payments, is that payments is always the starting point for what I find to be a really encouraging sign that the rise of Asian kind of marketplaces as well as global marketplaces that operate in Asia is this trend of embedded finance. So embedded finance, essentially allows new users, especially those who are new to the internet, to leverage digital services by just having an app on their phone, like a Grab or a Gojek. And that has really facilitated, familiarity and trust. And as you know, trust is really critical as people who are new to the internet try to leverage these services in increasingly sophisticated ways. So I think the other thing to think about as we talk about embedded finance is also, as part of, industry responses and collaboration with government, how do we ensure that those embedded financial services are not only safe and secure, but also address the gaps in the market? And this is really where I'm excited, to be kind of joining you all today, because I feel like there are a lot of solutions that we can think about together. So let me pause there, Peter. I feel like I've said a lot. Can talk about payments all day.
I have no doubt. I've experienced it. Give us some examples. I've got a list of things I'd love. It's a terrific précis of the market and the importance and the dynamism in the market. And I'm sure there's going to be questions. I've got a list of them. But just where you finished there of these exciting opportunities, are you able to give us a snapshot of some of them? One of them?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you see, the example of like innovations that are actually Southeast Asia native, I feel like that is another really interesting trend that I would be remiss not to call out. Rather than being, recipients of digital payments innovation or recipients of digital financial services, we're seeing a lot of innovation take place. And a lot of that has to do with the encouragement as well as the strong kind of industry government collaboration. One good example is how QR code standards have been, kind of an area of focus for regulators around the world. And that has really, in this part of the world, and that has really led to adoption and, created entry points for trust for a lot of people, and also promoted interoperability across borders. I can now, utilize QR code payments in several different markets in Southeast Asia, and I think that's really encouraging. So that's one good example. The other, I think, example is we're seeing, a new wave of non-traditional financial institutions that are really trying to address the unbanked and underbanked populations in the region. They're not just neobanks, they're also collaborations between, traditional companies that might be in the grocery sector or in the kind of brick and mortar retail sector with, other technology players or with other kind of financial institutions that have been around for centuries. So you see all of these kind of synergies coming together to serve that population. And I think that's a really encouraging sign that we're looking at an advent of very customer-focused innovation and very specific innovation for Southeast Asia. The other thing, that I find really encouraging is that governments are actually coming together to help build alternative payment systems that are lowering cost and creating, secure environments for trade to take place. So I'm a big fan of real-time payments. You can send money, to your friend, your grandmother, but also to the person that you buy clothes from, or that, your hawker center. And, while a lot of these functionalities still need to be built out, for B2B or B2C use cases, and, for it to be a bit more internationalized, it's a great starting point. And I think, I am very appreciative of the efforts by the regulators in this part of the world to really lead the way in thinking about how instant payments can drive, growth and lower costs, because cost is a big part of adoption. And honestly, I think cost is a big part of trust, because if you see that you can't afford a payment method, you're not going to use it, and you're not going to grow to understand how to use it. So that's, those are 3 examples that I can think of.
Very good, very helpful. I'd actually like to dig into the embedded finance concept a little bit more if we can come back to it and spend some time. I agree with you. I think it's very important, and I think it's very misunderstood. I think one of the things that people don't fully recognize when they talk about it is increasingly what you're seeing and where the trust will come is you're not talking about the payments providers anymore. To your QR code example, payments get embedded into something else you're doing, shopping, entertaining, processing trade transactions, and you're not thinking about the payments or having to buy into the trust comes with whatever else you're doing, which becomes an important distinguisher. So I would appreciate coming back to that if we have some time. I'd also, the real-time payment systems, instant payments, faster payments, I agree with you. And I think ASEAN and the region tends to lead the world in a lot of this stuff right now. The regulators are doing a good job. I don't think, given this is a seminar about digital trade, that some of the importance of this is being properly unearthed. So if we can, be good to come back to that. One of the points that we keep making is when we did CPTPP, or TPP as it was in its first incarnation before we got the sequel, that we focused on was carving payments out. It was seen as systemically and strategically important to economies and to countries, and so it could not be part of the same negotiations around the trade agreements. And that filtered through into the next series of trade agreements. And the data localization, data sovereignty, data fragmentation rules were seen as, we get it when it comes to finance. It's important and it needs to have protections. And yet, as the data localization regulations in their many different conceptions now have flourished in recent years, the one area that we see trade in digital and data in volume is real-time payments. Cross-border payments are the biggest form of cross-border digital outside of phone calls that is out there right now. And so if that was so strategic and we're still, why aren't people recognizing the oxymoronic nature of some of the hesitations around these issues? But not putting you on the spot there, come back. Where I do want to dig in for 2 minutes before I move over to Raja is the digital financial inclusion piece, which links both of you. And we all agree this is important. It's a dragon we've been attempting to slay now for 40 years. And we are coming, and we appear to have a good news story. And digital lowers costs. It lowers barriers to entry. It rises the opportunity of providing low-cost solutions to all. You make the point, as many of us do, about access to digital payments and lending was crucial to merchants throughout the pandemic. First question that always strikes me when people say that is, so what about the people who didn't have access? What about the merchants who didn't have access to pay? Did they die in COVID? And is that the point that ADB makes of how we have to toughen and make more resilient our MSMEs? But here's my question. All the surveys I see, all of the information we're getting right now, the fintechs, and I hear you on the point of we're seeing innovation, but the fintechs that are doing these solutions are disproportionately focused on urban and upper tier populations. So what is it we do if we've got the solution to hand to begin across our regional markets to foster these low cost ubiquitous solutions in a way that will get and lift up the underserviced?
So I'm going to attempt to answer that question in several parts. It's a really big one, and I really appreciate, that question, and it's very complex. So my instinct, and I've been out of government for a while now, but my instinct is that in order for us to really make a meaningful dent in financial inclusion, we have to look at it from a collaborative perspective, but also to solve some of the underlying infrastructural issues. So, let me take an example of the UPI story in India. I think that, the UPI story is really informative in that it demonstrates how the Indian government, as well as Indian companies, really came together not only to help build the infrastructure that created an enabling environment for UPI, but also then came up with different innovative overlay services that served different components of the Indian population, right? And that created, a strong kind of economic environment that allowed different business models to survive. So I guess the first layer of the India stack really, kind of addressed the need for identity. And I know that Rajat is going to talk about that in a moment, so I won't steal his thunder. But the identity layer is a critical enabler for digital payments and a lot of other digital financial services, because you have to verify, you have to do KYC checks, right? And so by creating that enabler, the Indian government actually facilitated, the overlay services that were then able to proliferate. The other thing that I think, the India story kind of holds a lot of promise for us in ASEAN to really kind of learn from is that the second layer of the India stack, which allowed for a lot of trusted communication between traditional FIs and non-traditional tech players or non-traditional fintechs to be able to collaborate together, is that it created an interoperable system for communication. So on top of that layer, that infrastructure, you had interoperability and standards built that allowed for exchanges and allowed for innovation. And then the third stack is that trusted data fiduciary kind of layer, right? Which then allowed for all other kinds of services, not just payments, not just FS, to potentially be able to create other kinds of public services, not only for citizens, but also for the business or corporate sector, which is still kind of playing itself out. And so I wonder if we, as we look at financial inclusion as an industry and together with the public sector, we can start maybe looking at it from how do we build some public goods together? How do we build infrastructure as well as the governance layer that allows us to be able to innovate in a way that doesn't exclude, vast segments of the population. And then I think to your point about trade, it's really interesting to see that embedded finance has created entry point for consumers and citizens to be able to buy stuff online or kind of buy services online. But also what's really interesting that is a less kind of identified element of embedded finance is that it's also helped a lot of merchants to access lending facilities and also to be able to kind of raise funds from each other. And so you see a lot of, SaaS platforms working together with the likes of, marketplaces to be able to serve merchants and retailers in a vastly different way. It's aggregated, but also allows for fintechs to build on top of them. And so the collaborative disruption, I think, is really a pattern that I find encouraging, but I think more can be done to promote it.
Really helpful. Thank you. I'm going to move across to Rajat, but if we can come back to this, I will. I always get a bit nervous when the Indian example, it's an example that everyone who's interested in this part of the market needs to be across. But you and I have both worked with governments and regulators who have looked at this story and the breakthroughs that the Indian systems, UPI and the stack and the payment solutions that came over on top of it have fostered. Go and focus on the Indian model. And it's got its own controversies, and it's not necessarily one you can simply say, let's move this to another country. The points that I hear when you talk about this are the ones you started with, the collaborative need, the need for public goods that can be driven through, things that actually are going to change lives across this, and working out where those points of pain are on the costs that go into lowering affordability and adoption costs. So I always get a little nervous these days when I watched everyone rush off on missions to India and come back and try to reinvent the Indian system in a few of our countries. But we'll come back to that if we can. So thank you for that. Rajat, again, without any pre-planning, they segued nicely on this. We've talked digital identity as a lead-in to you telling us how digital identity works, but more importantly, is going to work going forward now that we've got the sea change that is happening. And I really don't mind if you call out what we've been getting wrong for so long as well. Let me just, before you start, remind people, given the expertise that you have in the virtual room, to use the chat function if they've got questions for any three of the speakers while Rajat takes us through the new brave world that will be digital identity. Rajat?
Thanks, Peter. Some of you might wonder that why the last speaker voice is not as sweet as the other two. I have cold, not COVID, so please bear with me. Apologies for that. With that, I'll start with the session, or I would say the topic I have: borderless digital identity. Usually, we have used cross-border words quite some time. It's very much linked to payment, and if the similar concept needs to be applied on identity domain, then we call it borderless identity. I was interrupting Peter when he asked about trust to a statement on third last slide, and I wanted to also provide some feedback over there. But yeah, I would say that trust or lack of trust is one of the key obstacles and people adopting digital channels. So let me start with trust. Our current definition for trust is it's a confident relationship with unknown. It's very simple and easy definition. But if you link it to digital world, there is simply more of unknowns. And yet the organizations offering digital services and people they are interacting with needs to be confident in their interactions within this environment. And if this leap of faith is to be rewarded, then trust has to be at the heart of the system. So for us, digital identity is about establishing that confidence and trust at both ends of the interaction. Each party needs to be confident that the party at the other end is who they say they are. And that both requires trust in the system that mediates that interaction. Next slide, please. Some of you might be wondering that why a payment background company or technology company is into digital identity. So I will give you some background for that. Our journey for identity started back in 2005 when MasterCard founded MasterCard Foundation. And one of the key, I would say, priorities for having MasterCard Foundation was financial inclusion. We had the population of world is somewhere around 7 billion, and the cards which are floating, or MasterCards which are floating around the globe is in the range of 2 billion. So of course, we were wondering that why we cannot reach and touch the lives of more people. And 10 years down the line after MasterCard Foundation, during one of the board meetings, if I have to summarize their feedback in one line, it was there is no financial inclusion without identity inclusion. And that's where we started looking into digital ID, what we can do, how we can help countries. And that's how we looked into trust and started working with governments, with like-minded companies, that what we can bring together in this sector. I will not go through the definition of identity. It's about it's a collage of an individual's data. There are inherent attributes which you have by birth. There are assigned attributes which, like, your parents give you name, or you have a government giving you passports, or the other governments giving you the residence card. And then some are acquired attributes, which are like when you buy a new vehicle, you acquire a new license number or a license plate. And reusable ID is about once you have those inherent attributes or assigned attributes or acquired attributes with you in the system, can you use them again and again in a safe and secure way to enable more and more transactions? Next page, please. There are, the other speakers also pointed out, there are numerous use cases of identity, and I will not spend much time, but you can see that it's touching almost every segment of our lives, from employment to shopping to healthcare to financial services to education, shopping, everywhere you need identity, and that's one of the key components, or I would say the base of the stack is identity. Next page, please. Before I go into the slide, I would like to thank the friends from World Bank who have collected this data, and the slide is coming from that. I tried getting that slide on a nice, I would say, paper. That how do I translate that data on the paper, and where each of the countries are in their journey for digital identity. This is in Southeast Asia context. So if you see, there are many enablers for identity, and we have listed down few. It's around technology, policy, legal enablers, whether the country has Cybersecurity Act in place or not, Digital Identity Act in place or not, whether there are trust frameworks available or not. And then the more up you go, of course, you have better coverage, better inclusion. You have foundational identity and functional identity figured out. So if I have I mean, I can divide this in three segments. One, the countries where they are figuring out how to do foundational identity, which means that the countries are still collecting the data of their citizens, demographics and biometric, and creating a database around that. So the countries which have done that, they have started offering some of the face-to-face services. And the more advanced countries are looking into foundational, they have foundational, so they are looking into functional identity, where they are offering more and more online use cases. The best example, people in Singapore will realize that SingPass is part of our day-to-day life. Almost for everything and anything and everything, you will need SingPass. So that's what digital identity brings to you. There is another flavor which is not on the slide here, but there are countries which where it's not either led by government or not public-private sector, but the governments have come out and laid down the trust framework. So one is that the India example, what Amira gave, or Singapore example, where countries said that, yes, we are going to do digital ID, and they have implemented it, and they have done it nicely. The other example is NDID in Thailand, which is a good example of public-private partnership, where the banks came together, they formed the consortium, and then the government supported with the regulation. And the third one is what you see in Australia and New Zealand, where the government came out with the trust framework. And then it's a level playing field for public sector or private sector to come and implement digital ID. So different flavors, different owners, I would say different kind of implementations. So this was the challenge what we saw when we started looking into identity, that how do we fit in ourselves, what we can bring on the table. Is there a possibility we can connect these countries together? So with that background, we'll move to next slide, please. I will not spend much time, but this is what we have done in terms of bringing to world. It's an identity network. No surprises, we have been running payment network. So you might be thinking that, yes, it's kind of a replica over there. But then I'll quickly go through the roles, what we have included in this ID network. It's a global network, so we want countries to participate into it. Where the network doesn't exist, we are going and working with the governments to put this network on. So relying party is essentially the entity which wants to vet my credentials. If you see on the right side, an ID network, you see relying party. So imagine me asking for a job at World Economic Forum to TUE. In all probability, you will reject my application, but then you are a relying party here, essentially wants to vet my credentials as a user, that if I claim that I have studied in a particular university, if I'm a citizen of a particular country, if I have proper rights to work in a particular country. So identity verification providers are the entity which have given me those credentials. It's in physical format. I have my passport, I have my permanent resident card, I have my university mark sheets. It's all coming from IVP. In physical world, what I do is that I scan those documents, I give it to relying parties that these are my credentials, you can vet it. We have transformed that the journey into digital world by putting up a network in between. We have added an additional actor here, the trust provider. It's essentially an entity where you are going to keep your attributes, which means that when you digitize your name, your passport number, your date of birth, your parents, your address, your university, you will need a place to keep those things. And the trust provider is essentially the entity which is going to provide you the place where you are going to keep your things. So this network, I assume it's simple, it's easy, clear. On the left side, you see another entity called IDP. It's essentially the entities which already have developed their own network and they don't need any help at domestic level, but they have aspirations to go beyond the borders and connect outside to other relying parties. So that's where we have introduced another actor, IDP. It's essentially countries or the identity networks like SyncPass or NDID, which are pretty mature. They can come to the network and have global outreach. One of the examples on next page, please. Our identity network is live in Australia with Optus. So here, so Optus is the second largest telecom operator in Australia. So with this, the journey of a user from Thailand traveling to Australia can get a SIM card using NDID. No need to take out your passport or take out your any other form of identity documents. In a safe, secured way, your credentials will be transferred using the identity what you're using, or people staying in Singapore will be able to connect to this journey. Imagine you go to Australia and you can use your SyncPass to rent a car at Hertz, to take out a SIM card. If you're going for studying, you can prove to the university that this is who you are, and this is your credentials. So this is where you have studied in Singapore. So that's the power what cross-border identity or a borderless identity is going to bring. Next page, please. So with that background, I will briefly touch about the corporate ID. I mean, we know that the internet has expanded the four walls of enterprises, massively reducing the cost of information exchange and transforming the way companies compete and collaborate, both domestically and internationally. Cloud computing had made access to businesses, services ubiquitous and accessible even on the most basic kind of mobile devices. Supply chains have evolved into digital ecosystem of international trading partners driven by information and working capital finance. However, the small or medium-sized interfaces often face unique barriers. So Amira mentioned about SME and the challenge they face in digital world, and I completely echo with that. The tools are there, the internet is there, but specifically SMEs interacting across the border have limited access to know your customers and know your suppliers, tools that establish the trust with clients and suppliers. So we have seen how we are trying to establish the trust in consumer identity, or how individual can go and transact beyond the borders. And here we are trying to see if we can apply similar set of things and have SMEs be able to transact beyond the borders. So establishing trust is key for both of these constraints. As SME need to be, I mean, the identity needs to be verified, and to be able to verify the identities of their customers and suppliers in a secure and safe way. Approximately 400 million businesses, SMEs are backbone of world economies. They are main source of job creation globally, accounting over 95% of companies, 60 to 70% employment. I think Tue will have better figures than what I have. But in a world which is changed by digital, they lack the right tools to migrate to the internet economy. You will be surprised to hear that 90% even don't have a website or a digital profile and lack financial support. So we are trying to bring the concept of corporate digital ID. It's not new. It's already exists in some of the developed places. Like in Singapore, we have CorpPass, which is essentially the corporate identity, a digital set of identifiers that can be decentralized and owned by the entities or SMEs, and then giving them enabling SMEs to efficiently access range of trade-related and transactional services using a single ID. In Singapore, yes, we can do that. One of the challenges, or I would say complexities, what corporate ID has in comparison to to consumer ID is that the stakeholders, you will not have, like in case of your personal ID, you are the owner of your attributes and data, and you control that and you own that. While in a company, you might have CEO operating with certain rights, you might have some directors operating with certain rights, you might have some other people would have access to some of the components of this and have certain rights. So granting rights and representations to stakeholder is one of the challenges. We are not going into that direction yet, but what we are trying to do is how we can assign corporate IDs and to be able to interact beyond the borders. Next page, please. So this is the last page I have. So good news. We are not trying to reinvent the wheel when we want to prove the concept of how cross-border corporate ID can be achieved. We are looking at countries where they already have national IDs and interoperability exists. And then on top of it, we want to build a layer so that we can make them interoperate with countries which have similar infrastructure. So for example, Singapore has CorpPass, Estonia has corporate ID in place. So we are looking into exploring how we can make them interoperate using this stack. I have taken more time. So with this, I'll stop, Peter, and back to you. Sorry, I had too much of things to speak. And
I'm a fan, Rajat, as you know. Kevin, can we leave the slides up and can you go back a few slides? Keep going. No, that's I want to stop on that one in a minute, but one more along. This one. So Rajat, I was trying to work out. I mean, you know how important I think. I'm going to ask in a second, why is this so important? And then my next question is going to be, why are we failing? You know how important I think this is, and you know how angry you make me every time we talk about this stuff, because you know we should be making better progress and people don't listen to you. But given that I pick on you, I wondered if you put this slide up just to make fun of me, and put Optus there just because you knew I wouldn't be able to resist. So the three points that spring to mind straight away when you do this, particularly when we're talking trust, the single biggest data breach in Australian corporate history, with Optus not able to control its network. And it's funny, no, that we're going to use them as an example. But here, if you want to address that, because it's sort of, it'll be on people's minds. I could care less. I got to Australia about 3 weeks ago, and the first thing that my mother asked me was how much I'd been affected. I didn't know what she was talking about. Of course, it's live in Australia. They all think this is a terribly big deal. Here's my couple of questions for you, though. I get what you're saying here, but I cannot take my digital identity. I cannot take my identity seamlessly from Singapore to Australia. I know the corporate network that you're talking about and the benefits that if the world existed like that, it exists, but I can't do it. I can't take my health records from Australia to Singapore. I can't do it. Even if I get people to sign off, it's impossible. I have various tax affiliations, as many of us do in these countries. And right now, if I have the Australians chasing me for various things and I say, but it's there in the Singapore system, I can show you, your friends in Singapore are very good at this, here's all the records. They literally say, but we can't trust that data because it's Singapore data, it's not Australian data. Now, I know I've segued slightly away, but a seamless common digital ID that was recognised would actually address that point fundamentally. So I hear you on this, but how come with this example as a centerpiece, those two countries can't even do a seamless digital ID?
So thanks for this question, Peter. I think so. No, thanks to you. You have done some good work in orchestrating getting the digital economy agreements or recognition or mutual recognition of data between countries. So these are the things which are necessarily required to be able to gain that or bring that trust between countries when you move data beyond the borders. There are two challenges. I mean, two pieces to this. One is, of course, you need regulation support, and the second one is the tech side. I don't think so. The tech side is the challenge. This is pretty simple. I mean, I would say not simple, but then this is manageable. I don't think so. We have challenges here, but yes, the regulation side is the big challenge. How we can make sure that the countries recognize each other identity credentials or other form of data. How we can make sure that the right assurance levels are there on both sides of the network trying to transact with each other. The best example is like if I create my identity in a country A, I show two documents to them: passport and my citizen card, which says my name is Rajat. So if I see my attribute name, then it has two documents are saying that it's me, Rajat, while the other country might use three documents to say that, yes, this is Rajat. So if you see the assurance level, it's not same. Different countries have deployed identity in different ways. There's different form of, I mean, the way when you assign the identity, different kind of authentication is done in place. So it's a big challenge to bring all those countries on a single platform and get them agree on the franchise, on the regulations, on the rules of the network. It's going to take quite some time. So yeah, I mean, from the last time we met, it was I think 2 or 3 months ago. We have made no progress. The slide is still the same. I'm still talking about the same use case because it's going to take time. But this is the future, Peter.
Yeah, which I said as well. And you're fighting the good fight. Kevin, take me back 2 more slides if you wouldn't mind. Okay, this one, fun picture. Thank you again to our friends at the World Bank, Jonathan et al. The pyramid slide, what just for people, because I got a couple of questions that weren't posted in the chat. What do the dividing lines indicate? We've got a few of our member states that are falling on the dividing lines as though they're neither fish nor fowl. They're not quite doing online digital identity, but they certainly do have face-to-face verification. What does that mean?
So yeah, the dividing line is more about those countries have deployed face-to-face identity verification services and now transitioning more into online world. So they have started offering online services. They are not there yet, but that's the natural or logical next step. So, for example, it depends on the priorities of the countries as well, Peter. There is no single definition of ID. Different countries are doing ID for different reasons. India did ID for financial inclusion and to be able to stop the fraud. I mean, if you see one of the biggest frauds which was happening was around government disbursements, where the pensioners, even if they don't exist, the families are withdrawing the pensions. So these kind of, there were clear priorities when the countries were designing identity network, that what they want to solve first, what they want to stop first, what is their priorities. So it doesn't mean that if country is at the bottom of the stack that they are not doing anything or they are behind the other countries, but it's more about what are their priorities and where they are focusing right now in terms of this triangle.
Okay, good answer, and thank you. Let me just change. I'm going to ask one more question here. I'm going to be opening it up a little bit now, and I'd encourage questions from those who have them online. But I will believe digital trade is important. I've sounded like the three of you, like I'm a member of the cheering squad here, and you know it's all going to be positive, and this is all a terrific thing. I fundamentally believe something different. I fundamentally believe at an important juncture in the world, digital trade is broken, particularly in our part of the world. And so we're talking about this in a system where the fundamentals either don't exist or we've broken them. And for a while now, we were heading into a world that had set up the ecosystem, and we were rushing towards fragmentation at both the bottom and the top layers. At the top layer, we have governance. At the bottom layer, we have infrastructure. My question to you in 1 minute, Rajat, is going to be, tell us why this is so important. Because if I focus on this pyramid, most of our countries, as the World Bank is indicating, would say they've sort of got all of these pieces. They've got those fundamental pillars. They've got inclusion and mandates and data protection, and they've got data privacy provisions, and they've got a cybersecurity unit, and they've put a regulation out. They've got registries, they've got validation schemes. Why is it important that we start getting this right? If I go back to Amira's point, we need to get the infrastructure right.
Yeah.
Why is it important that we recognize identity as a part of infrastructure if we're ever going to get this right from a cost, competitiveness and compliance issue so people can adopt it, and the interoperability part? Why is it so damn important? Because people think they're going down this line. But if I say digital trade is broken, we don't know what it is. We can't measure it. We can't therefore focus in and do it correctly. We can't see what's failing and we can't see what's working. We can't leverage political capital because we don't have the metrics to show when it is pulling through. And I position it out like that confrontationally to the three of you, because you're talking about the three big pieces: identity, transactions, and the overall ecosystem and trust. But if we can't name it in a way that's consistent, and we don't know what we're talking about, but we use digital trade and we think we're talking the same thing and we're talking different things, if we can't measure it, how do we show we've made progress, and how do we double down on the wins and begin learning from the losses? And so, Rajat, why is it so important to get this digital identity piece right? You're out there at the vanguard of where MasterCard shouldn't be. I mean, let's be honest, you're filling a hole in the marketplace that says we've got to get these systems interconnecting, and we'll do it stepping in from our non-profit piece to try and get you to have a hub. You know, as I do, that if we have multiplicity of those hubs, we've got a problem there and then. But if we do it from a protocol trusted framework piece, then economies and organizations ought to be able to recognize those attributes themselves in a way that they can go about their own systems, but they interlink and they intertalk. Why is it so important we get this right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's I would take the answer from very basic level, Peter. When internet was designed, or when we got the first internet on, when you started browsing things, identity and security was never the base of designing internet. That was not the core considerations when internet was put in place. So I think with time we are doing the patchwork of bringing the right tech enablers, right policy things to be able to give people the platform in which they can access, they can interact in a safe and secure way. And if you see from, I mean, the various use cases I was pointing out, that the financial inclusion piece, I mean, the feedback after 10 years of financial inclusion journey from MasterCard Foundation, it's clear that you cannot achieve that in a meaningful way if you don't have identity inclusion. How it's going to bring the cost down, if you see from different countries, even if in this chart, if you see, banks are spending close between $2 to $10 to do KYC for their customers. That's a big burden, and imagine if you're talking.
It's not a big burden, my friend. It's insane at this point in time. It is literally highway robbery insanity.
So
you can't agree to that. You're working in a financial institution that does well out of this.
No, we don't make money out of that, and we it's like you see how this piece, the base of the stack, can solve these problems in a cost-effective way and bring connectivity to people.
Thank you. I agree. Good start. I'm still going to challenge you all with my questions, though. Kevin, can we drop the slide down so I can let the speakers be front and center? Rajat, thank you. Let me just move across to Amira. Picking up on that, maybe you want to give the same perspective from the payments perspective, Amira, but just framing it, there's two interesting questions in the chat on this. What should, from the government point of view, what can they be doing to be fostering both in the digital trade, both in the digital identity and the digital transaction spaces to foster digital? What should they be doing as the next steps? But equally, from the other side of the equation, the other side of the inclusion equation from a gender perspective, because we're talking the same, it is disproportionately women who are underrepresented and underserviced. It is disproportionately those in the rural communities. It is disproportionately the disabled and other marginalised groups. But let's start with the gender issue. What, from your perspective, what should we be doing to ensure greater inclusion from a female perspective?
Yeah, happy to take the first question about sort of what are some of the next steps that we can start, kind of building on together, right? And the emphasis on collaboration is one that I think is really intentional on my part, because I do think that the answers will come from both sides, industry and the public sector. So I think that when we think about payments, and transactions, there's really a couple of layers that really need to be resolved. On one hand, operating a payments or financial services business is really, really hard. And is a really highly regulated industry. And so kind of navigating the fragmentation of ASEAN is extremely challenging, not only for bigger companies, but also for smaller fintechs. And so, one thing to maybe kind of explore doing further that I would encourage, ASEAN regulators and policymakers to reach across the aisle, and we're willing to, all of us in industry are more than willing to support, is looking at ways to make domestic regulation a bit clearer, more transparent, and also a lot more kind of mutually recognizable. What do I mean by that? There's a huge delta between sort of the payment regulations in one part of ASEAN and the other. I'm not suggesting that there needs to be complete convergence, but are there ways to drive further alignment, either at a principles level so that companies know what to predict when they move from one jurisdiction to another, or having very clear kind of ways for us to understand, how we should start positioning ourselves if we want to move from Malaysia to Indonesia to Thailand to Singapore. So I think looking at it from a domestic perspective will also be really critical. Within the domestic system, one of the things I find really encouraging, and regulators are really looking into this, is standardization. The QR code example is a really good one. But as we move towards a world where instant payments is going to be, even more integral, I would encourage, all of us to work together to ensure that some of these new payment infrastructure is more accessible and inclusive, not only to traditional financial institutions, but non-bank financial institutions that are a little bit, less, I guess, ordinary. We're talking about fintechs, we're looking at merchant retailers that have a vested interest in improving some of the use cases and functionalities. What are some of the rules of the game that we can kind of collaborate and work on together so we can bring the quality of those infrastructure up, right? So that's the domestic level. Across borders, I think that there are already some really interesting experiments, including the ones that the Bank of International Settlements, is championing to bring national payment systems a bit more interoperable. And a lot of governments like Bank Negara in Malaysia and Singapore and a lot of other places in ASEAN are starting to participate in those experiments. And I would encourage us to continue down that kind of pilot initiative path, because it does create avenues to explore solutions together. And again, it would be really important for that process to be inclusive, not only of, the pre-existing banks that are traditional settlement mechanisms and clearing mechanisms, but other kind of technology companies or local kind of financial services companies to be able to participate if there is an opportunity or there is a relevant area for them to. And then I think that, I think people are often surprised that a lot of analog barriers stand in the way of, payment innovation. So, if we think about cross-border kind of payments, things like, local entity requirements in order to be able to, process payments and do local acquiring. That's one thing that, may be worth revisiting, because in many respects, it doesn't actually guarantee the safety of funds, nor of the data of customers and merchants and other people who use that system. Is there a way for us to collaborate to look at cross-border regulation a bit more deeply and identify some of those pain points that actually no longer serve a purpose in this day and age? So that's the cross-border angle. I guess as we think about some of these layers, I would also be remiss if I didn't kind of bring the perspective of what it takes to promote innovation. And Amazon is a consumer of financial services. We actually really benefit from the thriving fintech space in this part of the world. We work very closely with a lot of your fintechs in many markets in ASEAN. And so, innovative policies that actually promote the development of some of these ICT companies, bringing back talent from, from the US, from Silicon Valley, of ASEAN nationals who've worked, in some of these places. It's a really big deal. How do we then promote also incentives and ways for them to start thinking about, starting up startups and also having them function across ASEAN? Is there a world that in which we can promote innovation as a collective across ASEAN? I think that would be really important. And then to answer your gender question, Peter, to the extent that I can, because I'm really not an expert in this space, although I do think about it, as a woman in finance, is potentially looking at some of the barriers that women face on a day-to-day basis in terms of having access to any kind of public service, right? I think there are a lot of, World Bank and WEF studies out there that identify some of the choke points for women to not only leverage identity services or even have a form of national identity, but also the kind of discrimination that they might face in, being able to set up an account. And I think that this is where, policymakers can help articulate some of the needs, and also where grassroots organizations and think tanks that are really deeply on the ground can help industry really identify the pain points, so then we can build a tech solution. As Rajat pointed out very beautifully, the tech part is not that challenging. There are lots of bright minds out there who can build those things, but we may not be able to diagnose the issue without the help of, grassroots organizations, political leaders, as well as just interested people who want to solve the gender issue. And so that will require a lot of collaboration before even the policy change, can take place. So if we think about it from, a life cycle perspective, collaborating to diagnose, building the tech, and then maybe developing use case-based regulation that help to protect that process could be a good starting point.
Rich answers. I'm conscious of time. I do want to move to Tui to give her a chance to give some answers to the same questions. But before I just want to dig in. There was a lot there, Amira, so thank you. I thought I was going to go in order. I'm going to go backwards. I think on your final point there, what once upon a time was called positive discrimination, of identifying the issues that, for example, women might have and making sure you are solving for those in day-to-day examples. I like the way you summed it up. Digital isn't going to be the answer. Digital might give you the tools as long as you frame it, the answer. But then I go back to, if we're not measuring this correctly and we can't target appropriately, how do you deliver the solutions to the people who need it most? You're going to end up delivering the solutions to the people who are loudest or have their hand up the highest. And so you'll create so what's the role of government there? Because you've done it quite nicely. The digital isn't going to address it. We need programs that will lead it in.
Yeah.
What's the role of government?
Yeah, I think that's a strong role for government. And I think this is really where the role of local and municipal government really is integral, right? Not only kind of federal regulators, but also the people who are closest to the ground. and they'll be able to work with, organizations that actually serve some of these segments and understand their needs, not only from an identity perspective, but behaviorally, what forms of identity could work. One of the examples that, I was reading up on was related to internally displaced people, and how, you're using biometric data to help IDP, people in IDP camps to gain access to cash and other services. And this is fascinating from a technology perspective, but from a policy perspective, lots of questions about whether or not they understand, the kind of data privacy implications there might be, but also whether it is appropriate for a woman, in whatever culture we're talking about, to be able to sort of like attain the biometric data consent. So lots of things, I guess, implicit in that.
Okay, I need to move across. Thank you again. Very short answer, if you can, to your point, which you've just touched on again, the need for cross-border regulatory revisiting, simplifying for regulations that may now be out of date, not fit for purpose, that we need to revisit. You used in-country registration and so on as examples. Who leads on that? Do you have a simple answer?
I guess trade ministries are a great starting point, and maybe that's my starting point because I used to be in one. But a lot of the DEAs that are being developed right now are really, high quality starting points for envisioning modules that actually express the cross-border challenges that we face. So I would really love to see, a lot of DEAs tackle some of these real life issues in payments and across all of the e-commerce agencies.
If I continue my argumentative stake on this, my problem with that answer, and I don't have a better one right now, is that the trade ministries they don't have the same skill sets that we were calling out on our population. Inevitably, we put a proposal forward, a new negotiation point, they've got to go back to capital and go to the experts who are important in these areas. They're not staffed up on digital. And we need these people to be better staffed up on digital. As hard as they're trying, as good as the agreements are a first step in, they need to recognise the skilling that needs to be happen as well. Tweet, your perspective on the same sort of issues. Are we broken? Because you gave a very positive picture.
We are not broken if we get it right. So
big caveat, my friend.
Totally aware of the mismatch in expertise and information, and that is exactly where the World Economic Forum provides its platforms to connect different stakeholders in the society so they can complement each other. Say the government, they're not, I would say, not the strongest one on technology, then why don't we bring in the technology sector to complement, the gaps of skills? And in terms of, policy, I come back to my first point. We should promote evidence-based. So whatever we propose, for example, it should not be the view from the World Economic Forum, the view from Amazon, or the view from MasterCard individually. But, referring to reports like ours, for example, is the views of ASEAN people. So we have here the views of 40,000 to 90,000 people. So yeah, the governments, you listen to the call from your own people. So that's what we wanted to offer with reports like our ASEAN Digital Generation report. And in there, I think Sharat or Amira, you mentioned earlier about gaps in rural, urban area, and also gender gap. In our report, we actually look at the profile of respondents. So we can break down the insights for different segment of respondents. So you will see in the reports that I included in my slides. And if you need more information on those, like for everyone in the call today, if you need more information that can support your work that you're doing, feel free to reach out. And also the World Economic Forum, again, on the gender topic, we also have the gender gap report. Peter, you talk about referencing point measurement. This report is exactly what we offer. We want everyone to talk the same language, basically. If you say gender inclusivity, closing the gender gap, what do you mean? What are the metrics that you could use to, to make sure that everyone in the same table actually speak the same language and work toward the same objective? So this is exactly what we want to achieve with our various reports. Yeah, again, on the last question, what needs to be done? Maybe one of the initiatives to promote digital trade in the region. I'm glad that Amira mentioned DEA, the Digital Economy Agreement, and I would be very, very curious to see the feasibility study of the ASEAN Digital Economy Agreement Framework Agreement, and hopefully the negotiation for the framework will start soon, and that would be one of the best.
Kicked off now. The tender was released this morning. They're kicking off the framework. Perfect. Yeah, well, not so much, because I just came from conversation with ASEC and they're kind of nervous about what they're going to get. So you could all weigh in and give them some guidance. Tui, you and I have talked about some of this stuff before. I agree with you on the evidence-based stuff. You've got your working groups that you're running. We don't have digital trade statistics that are reliable, comparable, and time series based. We need the stats that the countries all be held to, right?
I think you need to speak with our colleagues at the WTO and other UN agencies on that as well.
I do, but then I get angrier than I do at Rajat for not solving my problems already. I've got no patience on this stuff. But I hear you. Given that we've ended with you being able to have the last word, Tui, and you gave an answer to the question of where we could come together as WEF, do we have a working group on digital identity?
We
had one. You had one. I remember it was a while back. Can we have one? Can we bring all of Rajat's friends together so that they can actually yell at each other in the same space?
Sure. And we also actually have a new initiative called Digital Economy Agreement Leadership Group. Like we talk digital trade, and I heard what you mentioned earlier, Sharad, no digital trade without digital ID. So I guess it's a broader topic that can cover digital ID as well. So in this digital economy agreement leadership group, we wanted to bring in different stakeholders to really build capacity for ASEAN countries that are less developed than others peers, so that they can, negotiate the digital economy framework agreement with, the same level playing field.
Thank you, Tui. I'm getting
You're welcome to join that as well.
I'm getting messages, and please do, to people who are still listening, and we will send out notes, but I'm getting messages from people who are dropping off because they've got meetings to go to. They've enjoyed this immensely, but they're going off to other meetings because we are now over time. So could I bring this very quickly to a close? Can I thank all three of the speakers, Rajat Maharashi, Amira Karim from Amazon Pay, and Tui Nguyen from WEF. Thank you so much. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for the lively comments. Thank you for being so forthright. Can I thank my friends over at the RMIT APEC Study Centre, Kevin Nguyen, Lindsay Karaya, and Bonnie Rivendell for all the work they've had in putting the platform together. Could I thank my Access Partnership colleagues who put all of the work together in bringing my friends here and getting the platform together from a content standpoint? And can I thank Australia and AusAid for helping with their financial support for this and the ASEAN DTS Digital Trade Standards Initiative. With that, I will let you get back to your day, but you've given us all a lot to think about. Thank you to the three of you, and thank you to everyone who joined the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.